Anthropology, in general, is the scientific study of humans, human behavior, and societies in the past and present. Social anthropology is the branch that studies patterns of behavior. Cultural anthropology focuses on cultural meaning, and physical anthropology examines the biological development of humans and the segment that has experienced the most dramatic changes of the past decade, with advances in genomics and the sequencing of not only modern genomes, but unlocking the secrets of ancient DNA as well. Where in the not-so-distant past, anthropologists, historians, and religious scholars would have heated debates over the ethnic origins of humanity's earliest civilizations, we can now, thanks to genetic analysis, come to a definitive consensus over the identities of our ancient forefathers, with the same degree of certainty used in court providing paternity tests or forensic evidence used in convicting someone of a crime. That said, scientists have been publishing their findings concerning some of the most exciting eras of history, from the identity of ancient Egyptian mummies to unlocking the details concerning biblical stories known by billions of people worldwide. The tombs of ancient Egypt have yielded golden collars and ivory bracelets, but another treasure, human DNA, has proved elusive. Now, scientists have captured sweeping genomic information from Egyptian mummies. It reveals that mummies were closely related to ancient Middle Easterners, hinting that Northern Africans might have different genetic roots from the people south of the Sahara Desert. The study, published on 30 May in Nature Communications, includes data from 90 mummies buried between 1380 BC during Egypt's New Kingdom and AD 425 in the Roman era. The findings show that the mummies' closest kin were ancient farmers from a region that includes present-day Israel and Jordan. Modern Egyptians, by contrast, have inherited more of their DNA from Central Africans. Archaeological discoveries and historical documents suggest close ties between Egypt and the Middle East, but it is very nice that this study has now provided empirical evidence for this at the genetic level, says evolutionary anthropologist Omar Kokuman of the State University of New York at Buffalo. The latest analysis succeeded by bypassing soft tissue, often abundant in Egyptian mummies, to seek DNA from bone and teeth. Researchers carefully screened the DNA to rule out contamination from anyone who had handled the mummies since their excavation a century ago in the ancient town of Abu Sir el Melek. More than half of the mummies we studied had pretty decent DNA preservation, says co-author Johannes Kraus, a paleogeneticist at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany. The team succeeds where previous studies on Egyptian mummies have failed or fallen short, says Hans Schroeder, a paleogeneticist at the University of Copenhagen. Now, researchers can hope to answer questions such as whether immigration drove ancient Egyptian population growth, adds Sonia Sakrowski, a bioarchaeologist at the University of Southampton, UK. The scientists obtained information about variations in mitochondrial DNA, which is passed from mother to child from 90 mummies. Because of contamination, the team was able to acquire detailed nuclear DNA, which is inherited from both parents from only 3 mummies. Both types of genomic material showed that ancient Egyptians shared little DNA with modern sub-Saharan Africans. Instead, their closest relatives were people living during the Neolithic and Bronze Ages in the area known as the Levant. Strikingly, the mummies were more closely related to ancient Europeans and Anatolians than to modern Egyptians. The researchers say that there was probably a pulse of sub-Saharan African DNA into Egypt roughly 700 years ago. The mixing of ancient Egyptians and Africans from further south means that modern Egyptians can trace 8% more of their ancestry to sub-Saharan Africans than can the mummies from Abu Sir el-Malik. The new data can explain why the ancient Egyptians were so tightly aligned with people from the Middle East. Was it the result of migration, or were the Stone Age hunter-gatherers of northern Africa genetically similar to those of the Levant? It's too early to tell, Krauss said, but there's a better chance now of getting answers. This is the first glimpse of the genetic history of Egypt, he says, but it's really just the start. So the DNA confirms that the ancient Egyptians shared genetic affinities with Europeans, Anatolians, and fair-skinned people of the ancient Middle East. That would make sense, as not only are the ancient Egyptian mummies blonde or red-haired, the ancient Egyptian statues of their pharaohs and nobility have blue eyes. The same deep blue eyes we find in ancient Sumerian statues of their gods and nobility. More validation comes again by way of genetics, by recent published studies carried out by an international team of researchers led by scientists from the Sackler Faculty of Medicine in Tel Aviv University, the Institute for Galilean Archaeology, Kinneret College, the Israeli Antiquities Authority, and Harvard University. Blue-eyed, fair-skinned settlers inhabited the Levant some 6,500 years ago, according to an international interdisciplinary team of scientists. An article released Monday in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Communications solves the mystery of how Chalcolithic culture got to the Galilee via population migration. When they mapped the genomes of bones from 22 of the 600 individual skeletons discovered in a massive necropolis near Pekin in north of the country, the scientists found a genetic mix quite unlike that of previous and successive settlers to the region. In the article, Ancient DNA from Chalcolithic Israel reveals the role of population mixture in cultural transformation. The scientists concluded that the homogeneous community found in the cave could source 57% of its ancestry from groups related to those of the local Levant Neolithic, 26% from groups related to those of the Anatolian Neolithic, and 17% from groups related to those of the Iran Chalcolithic. The genetic analysis provided an answer to the central question we set out to address, said Harvard's Reich. It showed that the Pekin people had substantial ancestry from northerners, similar to those living in Iran and Turkey, that was not present in earlier Levantine farmers. The Chalcolithic era, also dubbed the Copper Age, follows the Stone Age and precedes the Bronze Age. There are already several DNA analyses for Bronze Age settlement in the Levant, including last summer's publication of research from Bronze Age burials that shows that 93% of the ancestry of modern Lebanese ancestry comes from the Canaanites. Now, the new Pekin genome mapping fills in a void of 3,000 years of DNA analysis. With the new study's conclusion that some half of the indigenous Chalcolithic people's genomes derived from ancient Turkey and Iran, it appears that these artifacts may have arrived during migration and were not merely as the byproducts of a trade route as previously suggested. The scientists uncovered some recessive genetic traits not usually expected in human remains from the Levant. Certain characteristics, such as blue eye color, were not seen in the DNA test results of earlier Levantine human remains, said May. The blue-eyed, fair-skinned community didn't continue, but at least now researchers have an idea why. These findings suggest that the rise and fall of the Chalcolithic culture are probably due to demographic changes in the region, said May. As I've covered in my previous videos, the 4,000-year-old mummified remains found in China of 6 foot 6 inch tall, blonde, Aryan-looking people near those massive pyramids that the Chinese government still tries to conceal from satellite imagery by planting trees on top of them, are also from Iran. Not Ireland, not Germany, it's the other way around. They are Aryans from Iran that entered into Europe, the same way they entered India, entered Egypt, and even entered Ethiopia. As Herodotus tells us, the ancient Ethiopians were the fairest of all men. It is clear that the demographics that populate the world today, in most cases, are very different than what it was thousands of years ago. And the politically motivated professors and media should spend some time doing their job and teaching facts instead of social engineering and pushing cultural Marxist fairy tales. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. Please consider reading my published books available on Amazon. You can support my ongoing efforts with a donation on Patreon. There should be a link below. Thank you to those who share my videos, as I rely on word of mouth. And please don't forget to leave a comment. Your thoughts are valued and appreciated. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell for updates, and I hope to see you again soon. Around 500 BC, ancient Greece was comprised of two primary city-states that could be considered superpowers of their day, Athens and Sparta. The Athenians enjoyed a period of naval supremacy in the Mediterranean Sea and was a place where democracy, art, and philosophy flourished. The Spartans, on the other hand, were a militaristic society considered by historians to be among the most elite land-based fighting armies at their prime. Around 480 BC, these two rivals joined forces and teamed up to defend Greece from a common enemy, the invading Persian Empire. While the Spartans fought valiantly, as documented in movies such as 300, and the Athenians won decisive naval battles, the mighty Persian army still managed to burn down the sacred temples to the gods on the Athenian Acropolis. The Persians were eventually forced to abandon their invasion, and what followed was the golden age of classical Greece, which lasted for about 50 years, before Greece fell back into internal wars between the Greek city-states. After about a century of fighting, ancient Greece became depleted and vulnerable, this time to a new rising power to the north, the Macedonians. Under King Philip II, Macedonia emerged as a formidable military force, due in large part to being well trained, but also introducing a new type of weapon to the battlefield, an 18-foot-long pike called a sarissa, twice the length of a normal Greek spear, that proved to give a definitive advantage over the standard phalanx, the name given to the most common military formation at the time. In 338 BC, King Philip's army crushed the joint army of Thebes and Athens, uniting Greece, except for Sparta, under what became known as the Hellenic League. King Philip was assassinated by his own bodyguard and was succeeded by his 20-year-old son, Alexander, who was tutored by none other than Aristotle himself, and already experienced in the art of war. Alexander consolidated power by crushing his rivals and proceeded to invade Persia by 334 BC with an army of about 40,000. Victoriously penetrating into Asia Minor, finally confronting King Darius, King of Kings himself, whose army outnumbered Alexander's 2-1. Despite the numbers, Alexander achieved a stunning victory, massacring the Persian army, with King Darius fleeing in retreat, but Alexander capturing the king's wife, mother, and 3 children. Alexander went on to conquer the Phoenician coastal cities, continuing to Egypt, conquering everything in his path, and declared Pharaoh by the priests of Memphis. He then founded a new city, named it Alexandria, and eventually went on to establish another 12 cities, all bearing his name. Alexander marched eastward, conquering territory that extended to the ends of the known world at the time. But while there's a lot more to the story, I would like to now read a letter from Alexander the Great to Darius, king of Persia. And I quote, "Your ancestors invaded Macedonia and the rest of Greece and did us harm, although we had not done you any previous injury. I have been appointed commander-in-chief of the Greeks, and it is with the aim of punishing the Persians that I have crossed into Asia, since you are the aggressors. You gave support to the people of Perinthus, who had done my father harm, and Archas sent a force to Thrace, which was under our rule. My father died at the hand of conspirators instigated by you, as you yourself boasted to everybody in your letters. You killed Arsis with the help of Bogas and gained your throne through unjust means, in defiance of Persian custom and doing wrong to the Persians. You sent unfriendly letters to the Greeks about me to push them to war against me, and sent money to the Spartans and some other Greeks, which none of the other cities would accept apart from the Spartans. Your envoys corrupted my friends and sought to destroy the peace which I established among the Greeks. I therefore led an expedition against you, and you started the quarrel. But now I have defeated in battle first your generals, and now you in person, and your army, and by the grace of the gods I control the country. All those who fought on your side and did not die in battle, but came over to me, I hold myself responsible for them. They are not on my side under duress, but are taking part in the expedition of their own free will. Approach me, therefore, as the Lord of all Asia. If you are afraid of suffering harm at my hands by coming in person, send some of your friends to receive proper assurances. Come to me and ask and receive your mother, your wife, your children, and anything else you wish. Whatever you can persuade me to give shall be yours. In future, whenever you communicate with me, send to me as King of Asia. Do not write to me as an equal, but state your demands to the master of all your possessions. If not, I shall deal with you as a wrongdoer. If you wish to lay claim to the title of king, then stand your ground and fight for it. Do not take flight, as I shall pursue you wherever you may be." End quote. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. You can find my published books on Amazon. You can support my work with a donation on Patreon. There should be a link in the description. Thank you to those that share these videos, as I rely on word of mouth. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit like, and let me know your thoughts in the comment section. And I hope to see you again soon. Have a great weekend. The Muses inspired Hesiod to write the 800-line epic poem called Works and Days. In it, Hesiod tells a Greek creation story that traces the lineage of mankind through 5 successive ages or races. The most ancient is the Golden Age, the only age that falls within the rule of Kronos. It is said that it was a time when people lived among the gods and freely mingled with them. Peace and harmony prevailed during this age. Humans did not have to work to feed themselves, for the earth provided food in abundance. They lived to a very old age, but with a youthful appearance, and eventually died peacefully. Their spirits lived on as guardians. Plato recounts the golden race of men who came first, and he clarifies that Hesiod did not mean men were literally made of gold, but were good and noble and held integrity and virtue in high regard. He describes these men as demons upon the earth. Demons in this context comes from an ancient Greek sense, meaning knowing or wise or divine principle. They are beneficent, preventing ills, and guardians of mortal men. So please don't confuse the meaning with more modern negative connotations. The next age is called the Silver Age. The Silver Age and every age that follows fall within the rule of Kronos' successor and son, Zeus. Men in the Silver Age lived for 100 years under the dominion of their mothers. They lived only a short time as grown adults and spent that time in strife with one another. During this age, men refused to worship the gods, and Zeus destroyed them for their impiety. After death, humans of this age became blessed spirits of the underworld. Next is the Bronze Age. Men of the Bronze Age were hard. War was their purpose and passion. Not only arms and tools, but their very homes were forged of bronze. The men of this age were undone by their own violent ways and left no named spirits, but dwell in the dank house of Hades. It came to an end with a massive flood. Now you'll notice that each age gets progressively worse to this point. Lifespans are shorter, and life itself is more difficult or challenging. So we started with gold, then silver, then bronze, and we'll eventually get to the Iron Age, but not yet. In between Bronze Age and the Iron Age is what is called the Heroic Age. The Heroic Age is the one age that does not correspond with any metal. It is also the only age that improves upon the age it follows. In this period, men lived with noble demigods and heroes. It was the heroes of this age who fought at Thebes and Troy. This race of humans died and went to Elysium. Elysium would also be known as the Fortunate Isles or Islands of the Blessed, located in the Western Ocean at the end of the earth. And now we finally get to the Iron Age. Hesiod finds himself in the Iron Age, and during this age, humans live to an existence of toil and misery. Children dishonor their parents, brother fights with brother, and the social contract between guest and host is forgotten. During this age, might makes right, and bad men use lies to be thought of as good. At the height of this age, humans no longer feel shame or indignation at wrongdoing, and the gods will have completely forsaken humanity. And I quote, "There will be no help against evil." End quote. For those who have followed my work, I place the arrival or sudden appearance of Cro-Magnon as the time of the heroic age, which I've said is the only age that improves upon the age it follows. So each age follows a sort of devolution or degradation until the heroic age. And anthropologically speaking, it is with Cro-Magnon that we see a sudden leap in tool technology, art, animal domestication, and everything else we associate with civilization compared to other hominids of the Pleistocene. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. I want to thank all my supporters on Patreon and those who share these videos. Thank you. I rely on word of mouth. Please check out my published work available on Amazon. My books make a great gift. I love reading your insightful comments, so please leave me your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for updates. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful weekend, and Buffy and I hope to see you again soon. In the US, we are taught at an early age that Thomas Edison was probably the greatest inventor who ever lived. There is no argument that he created some of the most spectacular technology the world has ever seen. He certainly did hold more than 1,000 patents. However, it appears that he may have gone to any length to claim credit for inventions of other people's work and creativity. Edison gets credit for the fluoroscope. This was a device which first made X-rays possible and also added to Edison's growing wealth. The problem is that the actual inventor of a device to see the bones of a human was a German scientist named William Röntgen, who took an X-ray of his wife's hand several years prior to Edison's fluoroscope. Edison was more than happy not to correct the error. Another concept Edison is given credit for is creating devices for recording speech and other forms of sound. A French printer and bookseller named Edward Leon Scott de Martinville created his phonautograph more than 15 years before Edison's 1877 invention of the phonograph. Again, Thomas Edison made no mention of Martinville when marketing his own device. Many people regard Edison as the father of motion pictures. However, there's a fairly solid argument that Louis Le Prince created a working motion picture before Edison, but when traveling to America to patent it, he got on a train and nobody saw him again. His son continued with the patent request and eventually testified against Edison, but someone shot him, so Edison got the lucrative patent. There's no doubt, however, that Edison was a great businessman and knew how to manipulate the press in his favor. You probably heard about the famous rivalry between Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison, where Edison electrocuted cats, dogs, and even an elephant to make Tesla's AC/DC technology seem more dangerous than his own direct current technology. What most people are not aware of, however, is that Edison was very interested in the afterlife, entranced with it in fact, and in his eyes, life after death was not the way perhaps many envision it. His theory was that there was basically a set amount of life in the universe, and that it could not be created or destroyed, much like the conservation of energy or mass law in thermodynamics. This life, he surmised, came in the form of myriads of infinitesimal entities, each a separate consciousness, which acted much like atoms do with matter, forming the smallest building blocks of life as we know it. According to him, the individual consciousnesses in each person were made up of unique patterns of these tiny entities, which grouped together in swarms within the brain to form our soul. He believed that death came when these tiny entities disagreed, and that they could go on into existence beyond the physical body. In Edison's own words, and I quote, I believe that life, like matter, is indestructible. There has always been a certain amount of life in this world, and there will always be the same amount. You cannot create life, you cannot destroy life, you cannot multiply life. I believe our bodies are composed of myriads and myriads of entities, each in itself a unit of life, which band together to build a man. In our bodies, these entities constantly rebuild our tissues to replace those which are constantly wearing out. They watch after functions of the various organs, just as the engineers in a powerhouse see that the machinery is kept in perfect order. Once conditions in the body become unsatisfactory in the body, either through a fatal sickness, fatal accident, or old age, the entities simply depart from the body and leave little more than an empty structure behind. Being diligent workers, they naturally seek something else to do. They either enter into the body of another man or even start to work on some other form of life. At any rate, there's a fixed amount of these, and it is the same entities that have served over and over again. They fight out their differences, and then the stronger group takes charge. If the minority is willing to be disciplined and to conform, there is harmony. But minorities sometimes say, "To hell with this place, let's get out of it." They refuse to do their appointed work in the man's body, he sickens and dies, and they are all free to seek out new experiences somewhere else. When we die, these swarms of units, like a swarm of bees, so to speak, betake themselves elsewhere and go on to functioning in some other form or environment. There are many indications that we human beings act as a community rather than as units. That is why I believe that each of us comprises millions upon millions of entities, and that our body and our mind represent the vote or voice, whichever you wish to call it, of our entities. The entities live forever. Death is simply the departure of the entities from our body. If the units of life which compose an individual's memory hold together after death, is it not within range of possibility, to say the least, that these memory swarms could retain the powers they formerly possessed and thus retain what we call the individual's personality after dissolution of the body? I'm hopeful that by providing the right kind of instrument to be operated by this personality, we can receive intelligent messages from it in its changed habitation or environment. End quote. Edison surmised that if these particles of consciousness could be arranged back into their prior harmony, then that dead person's consciousness would be essentially resurrected. It was his guess that some sort of photographic plate could be used to record the precise layout of these entities and serve as a sort of snapshot to the personality that had passed on, allowing them to be put back together again. Edison apparently spent a lot of effort trying to prove that these theoretical particles existed, gathering a team of scientists to test out a machine that could detect them, and trying to craft a device that could be used to communicate with personalities that had passed from the world of the living. He would, in October of 1920, give a rather spectacular announcement to the media saying that he had been working on an apparatus that would be able to contact the dead, which would go on to be called the spirit phone. It is unknown just how far along Edison was on an actual device to talk to spirits, but Nikola Tesla was also developing a similar device at the same time. Both men were racing to create something that picked up on the frequencies of discarnate spirits, what today is called EVP, or electronic voice phenomenon. Nikola Tesla thought that the universe was composed of an infinite variety of sound and electromagnetic waves, and that if you could zero in on the right ones, you could hear the voices of the departed. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. You can find my published work on Amazon. Please don't forget to subscribe, hit like, share, and leave your thoughts in the comment section. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. Whenever I feel like just getting away, whether to think about something specific or to just reflect on life itself, I often find myself coming back to the beach. There's just something about the fresh air and looking out across the endless blue ocean that expands my mind and helps me to open up to new possibilities that just seem more difficult to do when I'm cooped up indoors staring at four walls. And on this sunny day in California, I started wondering about what happens after we die. Where do we go? Somewhere specific? Nowhere at all? A heaven or hell? Or maybe reincarnation? Although I've come across many theories, I can't say for sure, and I'm not sure that anyone else living knows with absolute certainty either. That said, Mr. Alan Watts offers an interesting concept for us to ponder. Let's have a listen.
Just in the same way as you don't focus your attention on how you make your thyroid gland function, so in the same way you don't have any attention focused on how you shine the sun. So then, let me connect this with the problem of birth and death, which puzzles people enormously, of course. Because in order to understand what the self is, you have to remember that it doesn't need to remember anything. Just like you don't need to know how you work your thyroid gland. So then, when you die, you're not going to have to put up with everlasting non-existence, because that's not an experience. A lot of people are afraid that when they die, they're going to be locked up in a dark room forever. And sort of undergo that. But one of the most interesting things in the world, this is a yoga, this is a way of realization. Try and imagine what it will be like to go to sleep and never wake up. Think about that. Children think about it. It's one of the great wonders of life. What will it be like to go to sleep and never wake up? And if you think long enough about that, something will happen to you. You will find out, among other things, that it'll pose the next question to you. What was it like to wake up after having never gone to sleep? That was when you were born. You see, you can't have an experience of nothing. Nature abhors a vacuum. So after you're dead, the only thing that can happen is the same experience, or the same sort of experience, as when you were born. In other words, we all know very well that after people die, other people are born. And they're all you. Only you can only experience it one at a time. Everybody is I. You all know you're you. And wheresoever beings exist throughout all galaxies, it doesn't make any difference. You are all of them. And when they come into being, that's you coming into being. You know that very well. Only you don't have to remember the past. In the same way, you don't have to think about how you work your thyroid gland or whatever else it is in your organism. You don't have to know how to shine the sun. You just do it. Like you breathe. Doesn't it really astonish you that you are this fantastically complex thing? And that you're doing all of this and you never had any education in how to do it? You never learned, but you're this miracle? Well, the point is that from a strictly physical, scientific standpoint, this organism is a continuous energy with everything else that's going on. And if I am my foot, I am the sun.
It's a very deep concept, hard to totally get my mind around. If true, it would mean that every amazing experience, every lottery winner, every first date or wedding, and likewise every case of suffering and illness and even murder, all those experiences we would all experience. And the next thought is how it gives a literal interpretation of karma, since everything you put out is literally and ultimately directly experienced by another version of self. Let's consider the implications a little further.
Let's suppose that you were able every night to dream any dream you wanted to dream. And that you could, for example, have the power within one night to dream 75 years of time, or any length of time you wanted to have. And you would naturally, as you began on this adventure of dreams, you would fulfill all your wishes. You would have every kind of pleasure you could conceive. And after several nights of 75 years of total pleasure each, you would say, well, that was pretty great. But now let's have a surprise. Let's have a dream which isn't under control. Well, something is going to happen to me that I don't know what it's going to be. And you would dig that and come out of that and say, wow, that was a close shave, wasn't it? And then you would get more and more adventurous, and you would make further and further out gambles as to what you would dream. And finally, you would dream where you are now. You would dream the dream of living the life that you are actually living today. That would be within the infinite multiplicity of choices you would have, of playing that you weren't God. Because the whole nature of the Godhead, according to this idea, is to play that he's not. The first thing he says to himself is, man, get lost. Because he gives himself away. The nature of love is self-abandonment, not clinging to oneself. Throwing yourself out, as in, for example, in basketball, you're always getting rid of the ball. You say to the other fellow, have a ball. See? And that keeps things moving. That's the nature of life. So in this idea, then, everybody is fundamentally the ultimate reality. Not God in a politically kingly sense, but God in the sense of being the self, the deep down basic whatever there is. And you're all that, only you're pretending you're not.
Of course, it's usually beautiful, something I never get tired of, so I'm glad I can share it with you. The song in the intro is called Eternal Flame, and while it's meant to be a love song, the title reminds me of an ancient religion which flourished in places like Babylon, the Persian Empire, and areas influenced by the ancient Phoenicians, where, like the sun, a lit fire or even candle represented light, and be kept burning continuously, a true eternal flame. Starting around the time of the 12th century in Europe, around the Adriatic Sea, which is a body of water separating the Italian peninsula from the Balkans, arose a powerful influence called the Venetians, after the city of Venice, who they themselves trace their lineage back to the city of Tyre on the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, which was the capital city of the Phoenician Empire. These people could be called Canaanites, a term which comes from Canaan, who according to the Bible was a son of Ham. Ham was a son of Noah, and the father of Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Many people hear these terms and incorrectly associate them with sub-Saharan Africans because they're associated with African civilizations and are today populated by a demographic primarily composed of a black phenotype. But keep in mind that we're talking about thousands of years ago, not modern times, but ancient kingdoms which no longer resemble the ancient kingdoms described in the Old Testament. So, for example, it should not be surprising that the DNA of pharaohs differs from many modern Egyptians, or that modern Ethiopians, which today is a highly mixed population, is not the same as those described in the Bible, such as the Queen of Sheba, or the allegedly blonde angels who, according to Ethiopian myth, built the stone churches of Lalibela, filled with depictions of a fair-skinned race, swastikas, and Templar crosses inside of Solomon's seal. So the term Phoenician, which means red, comes from the Greeks, and the term Canaanite came from the people who wrote the Old Testament. In any event, they were a powerful seafaring civilization that dominated the Levant, Mediterranean Sea, and North Africa, regardless of who lives there today. These Hamites, or Canaanites, were not sub-Saharan African, and according to recent DNA sequencing, share genetic affinities with modern Europeans. They grew very wealthy and powerful through trade. They were merchants, and their vast trade network helped spread the alphabet that many of us around the world use today. History tells us that they suffered several major military defeats, starting around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, which collapsed the Hittites and Egyptian empires, but the Phoenicians, however, survived and even thrived for a while, until Alexander the Great attacked Tyre in 332 BC during his conquest of the Persian Empire and on his way to taking Egypt. Alexander's Macedonian army was initially unable to capture the city through conventional means because it was on an island that had walls right up to the sea, allegedly standing 150 feet tall, which is probably an exaggeration, but the island was very well fortified. Alexander's request was simple. He wished to sacrifice to Hercules in Tyre. The Phoenician refusal to capitulate to Alexander's wishes was tantamount to a declaration of war. In a last-ditch attempt to prevent a long and exhaustive siege, he dispatched heralds to Tyre demanding their surrender, but the Macedonians were executed and their bodies hurled into the sea. The details of what happened over the next several months were very dramatic and quite exciting, but would make this video too long. But in a summary, Alexander's forces were eventually able to breach the walls, slaughtered most of the Phoenician forces, including crucifying thousands, and then he held a procession through the streets of the city, where Alexander then made his sacrifice to Hercules. With Tyre subjugated, Alexander could turn his attention to subduing Egypt. Of course, the Phoenicians survived in other colonies, such as Carthage, which was eventually defeated by the Romans during the Punic War. But their ancient Canaanite religion and influence survived covertly through the Roman Empire, rising again to prominence through the use of banking and usury in Europe. Usury means lending money at unreasonably high interest rates. From about 800 AD on, Venice was an increasing power in the Mediterranean. The Bank of Venice, established in 1157, was the first national bank to have been established within the boundaries of Europe. It became a great sea power, which became a dictatorship over the Mediterranean around the time known by historians as the Fourth Crusade. Now, I understand that there are those that like to claim that the Crusades had something to do with Christianity, but this is only the surface story, which I will get into more detail in a future presentation. The Venetians disseminated their ancient cult in the form of secret societies, as well as imposing debt wherever they could, usually by covertly manipulating kingdoms or city-states into waging wars with each other, financing both sides, plunging Europe into war with a divide and conquer propaganda campaign. They were involved in ritualistic cruelty, sexual deviancy, and maintained their ancient tradition of sacrifice. The existing political institutions of Europe collapsed around 1250 to 1267 in a series of wars and invasions by the Venetian allies penetrating into Europe from Eurasia. Then, in the middle of the 14th century, there was a chain reaction of bankruptcy, starting with the King of England, who decided that his tremendous debts brought about by usury was evil, satanic, and decided that these debts were sinful and refused to pay to the major banking families that had already looted most of Europe. Of course, this banking structure eventually moved north and took over London, and today the tradition continues through the IMF and Rothschild banking dynasty, who greatly influence global finance, media, corporations, and politics.
In 1000, the Byzantine Empire underwent a fundamental crisis. That was the period when Venice started to take over more and more of Europe, and eventually the power center shifted to the financial oligarchy in Venice. So then in 1066, the Normans took over England and the Saxons got defeated. And then eventually Venice for a very long time remained the power center of the imperial structure. So you are really looking at a succession of different empires. Now naturally Venice in this period, in this long period, underwent changes, family changed, replaced others, but the oligarchical structure essentially remained the same.
The Venetians are very good at psychological warfare as well. That if you read Friedrich Schiller's Ghosts here, you can see that what you do is you pretend to be people's friends. You find out what they want, what their weakness is, and you give it to them. If they want money, you give them money. If they want sex, you arrange for that. If they want drugs, you arrange for that. Whatever it is they want, their weakness is, you feed them. And then you tell them, okay, I'm doing all this for you and I just need these little favors. And you corrupt them. And you corrupt them until you can control them. And of course, you know what they're doing, so you can always blackmail them if they try to get out of line. But basically what controls them is the knowledge that if they don't go along with you, then they lose out on all these things they like. You know, if they play ball with you, then they become rich, they become famous, they have all of their desires sated, they get everything that they want, but in a mental state which is increasingly depraved and subject to manipulation. And that's also the Venetian method, that you win by corruption. And that the thing that the empire fears most of all is an honest man who isn't corruptible because he doesn't want those things.
With their reassurance of complete maritime dominance, the Venetian oligarchy used their power over the Mediterranean to internationally centralize the control and organization of money within their financial empire. Thus, no country could produce bullion for its own use, and all currency exchange had to take place in Venice.
They are lending money to the major houses of Europe, the nations, or what passed for nations at that point, the various kingdoms and duchies and things like that. And so they get them into debt. Now, for example, the King of England was in significant debt to the Lombard bankers, which was the Venetian banking system, and in particular to the House of Bardi. And so the king, pledged as collateral the wool production of his kingdom. And then, of course, he's going broke, and so he needs more money. So he borrows more money, and then he pledges all of the sheep as well. The key thing about this kind of debt farming, is that once you incur a debt, the debt never really goes away. Because the interest rates that you have to pay, the money that you have to pay to service this debt, is such that you quit building your country and you start trying to pay your debt. And then you have to borrow more money to pay your debt because you get further behind. And then your interest rates get higher, your debt service becomes more. And you set off on a process that never really ends until everything blows up. But that's the Venetian method of control. And that method has not changed since the days of Venice.
The oligarchy proceeded to move north in search of a new capital from which to operate. They settled throughout Northern Europe, opening their first major headquarters in Amsterdam, Holland. Centuries later, they consolidated their true base in 1763, upholding their public political headquarters in London, which remains still today.
The Baroque is a highly ornate and often extravagant style of architecture, music, painting, sculpture, and other arts that flourished in Europe from the early 17th until the mid-18th century. It followed the Renaissance style, with great innovations in dance appearing in the 17th century, originating at the French court under Louis XIV. And it is here that we see the first clear stylistic ancestor of classical ballet. Louis XIV was a major influence in the development and promotion of Baroque dance. Even at the age of 14, Louis was an accomplished dancer as the sun god Apollo, an image that he was to cultivate throughout his life.
Puissance, plaisir, lumière.
During the 17th century, dancing had not only a great social importance, but could also carry political importance. Although celebrating traditions with masquerade balls had been around since the 14th century and all throughout the era of the Renaissance, masked balls did not really come to Europe until the 17th century. Hiding one's identity is the theme behind wearing masks at masquerade events, and particular masquerades were for the wealthy and posh, which required an exclusive invitation to participate. There was a strict code of conduct and behavior which had to be followed, and everyone had to come in full costume. Baroque means irregular in French, and is said to originate from the Portuguese word barroco, meaning imperfect pearl, like the irregular shaped pearl that was used in the jewelry of the time. The Carnival of Venice is an annual festival held in Venice, Italy, that ends with the Christian celebration of Lent, 40 days before Easter, the day before Ash Wednesday. The festival is world famous for its elaborate masks and currently seems to be growing in popularity since around the 80s or 90s. However, under the rule of the Holy Roman Emperor and later Emperor of Austria, Francis II, the festival was outlawed entirely in 1797 and the use of the masks became strictly forbidden. It reappeared gradually in the 19th century, but only for short periods and usually for private feasts with rumored ritualistic activities.
Did you know Stanley Kubrick filmed his famous movie Eyes Wide Shut inside the Rothschild family's country estate? Theories swirled that Kubrick made his movie about the real-life ultra-elite and their secret occultic gatherings. Well, take a look at these pictures that show an actual Rothschild event from 1972. On the surface, it looks like a pretty magnificent surrealist ball, but there are clear occult references. Much like the film Eyes Wide Shut, occult imagery is hidden throughout the night, starting with the invitations, which were written backwards. Reversal or inversion of sacred objects is typical of black magic and satanic rituals. The exterior of the Château de Ferrier is lit up in a moving orange light, giving it the appearance of a fiery inferno. This hat, designed by Dali, also has hidden symbolism of androgyny by having half of Mona Lisa's face. Harnessing male and female power is important to practitioners of the left-hand path. And although Dali traditionally paints ants and grasshoppers in his paintings to evoke death, decay, and trauma, this work of art has scarab beetles, which symbolize the Egyptian mysticism of Osiris, the Sun King. This guest's costume resembles the famous painting Son of Man by Magritte. Both the apple and the eye of Horus symbolize the forbidden knowledge of Lucifer in the Garden of Eden. The hostess, Marie-Helene de Rothschild, is seen wearing a giant horned head, crying real diamond tears. Is this a representation of the sacrifice to Baphomet, who will share wealth and riches only after sacrifice? It's not exactly clear when in 1972 this party took place, but from the look of the decorations and the menu, it's definitely a fertility ritual. The dinner table serves dismembered dolls and cracked skulls. For dessert, a human sacrifice in a bed of roses. The rose, of course, is a symbol used by many secret societies, and it represents virginity, fertility, sexuality, and immortality, as well as silence and secrecy. Here's Salvador Dali, who helmed the Surrealist movement. At first, this seemed like a Surrealism party in his honor. But consider the aims of the Surrealism movement itself: to resolve the contradictory condition of dreams versus reality, and allow the unconscious mind to express itself. Occult imagery is very real, and it's everywhere, in movies, television, music, and fashion. The power derived from these occult symbols and imagery is very real to the elitists that congregate in their separate reality.
So shall we burn thee once again this night, and in the flames that eat thine effigy, he shall read the sign, Midsummer sets us free. Ye shall burn me once again. Not with these flames. Summer sets us free.
And that is just the tip of the iceberg. The elites are riddled with perverse secret societies that are obsessed with harnessing the power of dark forces. There's the public perception of the occult, and then what is actually happening. It's fantasy and folklore versus the real, intangible, dark power that the elite are able to harness by being practitioners of the occult. And it's this very art and imagery that we see over and over again, that it's just the expression of their dark souls.
My name is Robert Sepehr. Thank you for watching, sharing, subscribing, and don't forget to leave a comment. See you soon. While I'm certainly not the king of the world, I like to think that I'm one of the most academically honest anthropologists in the world, because rather than push any given political agenda, I go where the truth takes me, which can be difficult to discern because the academically accepted interpretation of truth is dictated by corporate entities and bankers that are anything but academic. As most people know, Hollywood movies have been used for decades now to sway and manipulate public opinion for purposes of social engineering, or to omit certain scenarios from historic events altogether. Just think of any blockbuster movie that is based on historic events, and you'll find that it's riddled with overt propaganda and historic inaccuracies, whether it be about World War II, or the alleged peopling of the Americas, or movies like the Titanic, which had a $200 million budget, which was unheard of in 1997 when it was released. While this episode will focus on the true story behind the sinking of the Titanic on its maiden voyage, I'd like to open with a tribute to a truth seeker who also tackled this subject before the modern internet age, and whose research impacted me on my own path when I first started peeking behind the veil, even if I don't share all of his same conclusions in my current perspective. Eustace Mullins passed away in 2010 and is still defamed for his politically controversial views, which have often been labeled as conspiracy theories, but seem to have been prophetic in hindsight. Mullins wrote about an elite class of globalist bankers that he claimed were behind many of the wars and depressions that adversely affect all people of all races worldwide. He wrote about the Federal Reserve, which came about in 1913, but tied it to earlier central banking systems, which he traces all the way back to biblical times. While I did not read all of his books, and am not familiar with all of his theories, he has left behind numerous videos from conferences where he spoke out against what he believed to be corruption in finance, big pharma, academia, and the global media. Eustace claimed that several high-profile bankers had conspired to write the Federal Reserve Act for their own nefarious purposes and then induce Congress to enact it into law. That said, I appreciate his contribution in bringing attention to secret meetings held on Jekyll Island, which took place in the early 20th century, shortly before the sinking of the Titanic and the subsequent formation of the Federal Reserve. Jekyll Island is located off the coast of the U.S. state of Georgia and is currently run by a self-sustaining, self-governing body. While it is owned by the state of Georgia since 1947, before that, much of its land was privately owned, beginning in the colonial era, with secretive events that took place on the island during the early 20th century being central to today's episode. At the end of November 1910, some of the most influential men in America gathered on Jekyll Island for a secret meeting. Their names were Senator Nelson W. Aldrich, who was the leader of the Republican Party, Adam P. Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Department, Frank Arthur Vandercliff, who was President of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, who was also a prominent banker, Benjamin Strong, who was another important banker, and Paul Walberg, who, you guessed it, was another influential banker. The purpose of the secret meeting was to plan the country's monetary policy and establish a central banking system, which resulted in the draft legislation for what eventually became the creation of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Of course, there's a gap there from when the meeting took place in 1910 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913, which I'll get into. But first, allow me to briefly define what the Federal Reserve is. Although it has the word federal in it, which by definition implies it has something to do with the central government, in reality, it is the name of a group of private banks owned by private citizens such as the Rothschild banking family that prints currency, then loans this paper currency to the United States on interest. So rather than the US government printing its own currency backed by gold or silver, as stated in the US Constitution, this legislation made it so instead the US borrows paper printed by a group of private bankers that collect interest on every dollar printed backed by nothing. This ability to print and loan money on interest is what financed both world wars, drowning the nation in debt, and why $1 in 1913 is equal to $25 today.
So in effect, we're financing our trade with China, trade with Japan by our Federal Reserve currency, which is neither federal, it's not federal any more than the Federal Express Company is a federal company. And it has no reserves because it doesn't need any reserves because it prints its own currency. If you could print your own money, what do you need of reserves? You just go and warm up the printing press and turn out another $10 billion. So, and finally, it's not a system. It's called the Federal Reserve System. It's not federal. It has no reserves. And it's not a system, but I'm the only person in the world who's ever defined it in my works as a criminal syndicate. And that's what it is. It's a criminal syndicate, just like the mafia, which is one of its subsidiaries, and the CIA and all of the criminal syndicates work out of the Federal Reserve System. Because that's what a Federal Reserve System is. A central bank is a group of bankers which have total control of a nation's economy. And they print their own money, print as much as they want to, and it eventually becomes worthless. And I defined in my work that a central bank's principal role is for war finance, because war finance is the most profitable enterprise you can get into. And so if you're a banker, you're looking for the best investment you can make, which is a war.
Most intelligent people might think that this system is not only unconstitutional, but is unwise, resembling a Ponzi scheme, and designed to make a small group of bankers extremely wealthy at the expense of the working middle class, which gets stuck with inflation and debt. You might also think that surely there must be some sort of opposition to this financial corruption. What about them? This brings us back to those critical years, between the secret Jekyll Island meeting of 1910 and 1913, when the Federal Reserve Act was passed into law. To understand what happened to the opposition to the central bankers, we need to take a look at a man named J.P. Morgan, an American financier and banker who dominated corporate finance on Wall Street during the late 1800s, when he was a driving force behind the wave of industrial consolidation in the United States, spearheading the formation of several prominent multinational corporations, including U.S. Steel Corporation and General Electric, with controlling interests in AT&T, Western Union, and 24 railroads. J.P. Morgan funded and built the Titanic, as well as its sister ship called the Olympia. While there's much written on theories involving an insurance scam, where the damaged twin ship Olympia was really the ship that sank in an effort to collect insurance money on an already partially damaged vessel. I won't be addressing that conspiracy theory at this time, but there are several interesting videos by others available online for those interested. Instead, I'd like to focus on the fact that J.P. Morgan was booked on the maiden voyage but canceled the day before. The same fortunate outcome cannot be said for the most wealthy and influential opponents to the creation of the Federal Reserve Act, American millionaires who did not owe their fortunes to banking, such as Jacob Astor, one of the richest people in the world at the time, whose wealth in today's money was the equivalent of $2.25 billion, whose fortune was built in real estate, inheritance from fur trading, and as an inventor, incidentally a friend of Nikola Tesla, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the Spanish-American War. Another opponent to the Federal Reserve Act on board was Benjamin Guggenheim, son of a wealthy miner, who again was not a banker, and either was Isidor Straus, owner of Macy's department store, who, like the other successful non-banker businessman I just named, seemed too unlucky or too unable to seem to make it aboard a life raft, and instead died going down with the ship. It's interesting to note that there were no red flares on board to signal any boats for rescue. Only white flares that signal a party or that everything's okay. Yet these wealthy and politically influential men opposed to the Federal Reserve were invited aboard the Titanic for its maiden voyage, the same trip that J.P. Morgan conveniently decided to back out from at the last minute, with no Rockefellers and no Rothschilds on board. All major opposition perishing aboard the ship in 1912, with the Federal Reserve Act established the following year during the holiday season, passed through Congress when most were not even present.
Paul Warburg himself, who was the author of the act, and the other bankers had to, for the first time in their life, come down to Washington and lobby in the halls of Congress to get the Federal Reserve Act passed. And of course, they had to make a lot of promises, a lot of commitments, a lot of bribes. But since they printed the money, it didn't matter. So they bribed the Congress to enact the Federal Reserve Act, which was signed, but they still could not get a majority vote. So they had to wait till the Christmas vacation after Lindbergh and the Middle Western and Western congressmen had departed for Christmas vacation. Then they brought the Federal Reserve Act before Congress on December 23rd after the opposition had left. But they still had a quorum. They still could pass it. And so even the New York Times said, never has legislation of such importance been passed under such circumstances. In other words, the whole Federal Reserve Act was passed through fraud. It was passed more or less while Congress was in Christmas vacation. And so Wilson signed the act into law on December 23rd, practically Christmas Eve, and it became public law. So now that they had a central bank with the power to print all the money they wanted, a privately owned bank, and the Federal Reserve Act itself is an amazing act. It's an act of total monopoly because every word in it, first of all the money that the bankers can print becomes an obligation of the U.S. government, which means the U.S. taxpayer. Second, the stockholders of this private bank included in the legislation that no Federal Reserve Bank stock could ever be bought or sold on any exchange in the world. So in other words, the initial purchasers would own it in perpetuity, which is what happened because the Rothschilds, Warburgs, and Schiffs all bought the original stock in 1914 and have owned it ever since. And they've put it into foundations, so it can never be touched. And these foundations are the real government of the United States, Rockefeller Foundation. Nearly all of your major legislation in the United States is prepared by these foundations. And they submit it to Congress, and of course they have enormous staffs and billions of dollars. So they bring the legislation before Congress. And it's impeccable. It's researched and it's phrased and everything is done just right. And so of course the Congress accepts it. And they look around, they say, is anybody objected to any of this? And of course there's total silence. Nobody objects. So it becomes law. That's why you have laws constantly passed by Congress which are actively opposed by 85% of the American people. Almost everything that's done in Washington is opposed by 85% of the American people. So you have government by 15%, government by elites. And they're not even Americans. These are international elitists. They have no allegiance whatsoever to the United States, just like your Canadian legislatures have no allegiance to you. They have no allegiance to Canada. They're part of the international elite. But of course, they don't say this publicly, and the press hails them all as great patriots and dedicated people, selfless individuals. They love that word selfless. Imagine, all your legislators are selfless. They never have a selfish bone in their body because they're working for you. They want to give you things. And of course, the only purpose they have is to rob you. Not only you, but all 6 billion people in the world, because it's a government of robbery. So you have what you call the new economy in the United States, and probably Canada too. And the new economy is simply people working and creating and producing in spite of everything the robbers can do to them. Everything that's accomplished in this country is accomplished in spite of the foundations, in spite of the bankers. People have to work harder to pay the interest, but they do that. They rise to the challenge. At some point, the people will have to make themselves recognized, and they're doing this through the internet. The big question mark is the internet, and that's why Washington has been making frantic efforts to control the internet.
While Eustace is still slandered with derogatory labels, a Marxist tactic that has been effective since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, which I also covered in a prior video. Can anyone today deny that overt media censorship exists, regardless of what one's own political ideology is? While the Federal Reserve Act was allegedly passed in an effort to establish economic stability and prosperity in the U.S. by introducing a central bank to oversee monetary policy, one needs only look back at the history of the last century, including both world wars, which were financed by debt, and the subsequent inflation and financial consolidation of power, to see that the economic stability and prosperity was not intended for the general population, but for a small, secretive elite that does not owe its loyalty to any one nation, race, or religion, but to a globalist political agenda opposed to our freedom and committed to our servitude. In actuality, American history is far different from the way it has been presented in modern schools or portrayed on the big screen. Hollywood has a tendency to finance and promote blockbuster movies about historic events, which oftentimes, if not always, camouflages key points with a love story or some other distraction. One example of this is the movie Titanic, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, who put in a great job as an actor, but the film did not do the historic event justice, as it concealed the fact that many influential opponents to the Federal Reserve central banking system lost their lives with the sinking of that ship. It was this notorious incident in 1912 which made the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 possible. One of the most influential and popular documents exposing the formation of the Federal Reserve is a book written in 1994 by G. Edward Griffith called The Creature from Jekyll Island, which recounts a secret meeting that took place in 1910 on Jekyll Island, a stretch of white sand beaches and beautiful landscape off the coast of Georgia. It was an exclusive gathering of American financiers, politicians, and banking elite who covertly plotted the draft legislation for the creation of the all-powerful central banking system that not only financed both world wars, but has become an accomplice in the support of totalitarian regimes throughout the world. An excerpt from the book claims that, quote, there are few historians who would challenge the fact that the funding of World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War was accomplished by the Mandrake mechanism through the Federal Reserve System. An overview of all wars since the establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 suggests that most of them would have been greatly reduced in severity, or perhaps not even fought at all, without fiat money. It is the ability of governments to acquire money without direct taxation that makes modern warfare possible, and a central bank has become the preferred method of accomplishing that. We theorize a strategy dubbed the Rothschild formula, in which the world's money cabal deliberately encourages war as a means of stimulating the profitable production of armaments and keeping nations perpetually in debt. This is not profit-seeking, it is genocide. It is not a trivial matter, therefore, to inquire into the possibility that our elected and non-elected leaders are, in fact, implementing the Rothschild formula today.
When I did my research on this topic, I came to the conclusion, which may startle you folks here, that the Federal Reserve System does not need to be audited. It needs to be abolished. First of all, Jekyll Island is a real island. It's off the coast of Georgia. And it was on that island back in 1910 that the Federal Reserve System was conceived at a highly secret meeting that took place there. And what I'd like to do is talk about this meeting and show you that, in fact, the Federal Reserve was created there, and that there was a lot of secrecy surrounding it. And then we'll be confronted with the question, why the secrecy? When things are done in secret, there are often things to hide. And we'll explore what it was that they wanted to hide. And when we finally understand what that was, we'll be face to face with one of the most important facts about the Federal Reserve System that is not generally known. In 1910, Jekyll Island was privately owned by a small group of millionaires. In those days, they were millionaires. In today's dollars, they would be billionaires from New York. This is where their families went to spend the winter months. It was a resort island, a resort club. It was called the Jekyll Island Club. And there was a very elaborate clubhouse there, which was the center of their social activities. It's still there, by the way, if anybody wants to visit it. The island has been purchased by the state of Georgia, and this clubhouse has been renovated. It's a beautiful thing. And around this clubhouse, they had cottages, which were built by many of the families that belonged to the club. Cottages are not exactly the word I would have chosen to describe these structures. I remember on taking the tour through one of them, the guide said that there were 14 bathrooms in that cottage. So you have an idea of the kind of elegance that was there. In any event, the number of bathrooms has nothing to do with this story. I just get hung up on that because it's hard for me to imagine a cottage with that much running plumbing. But the important point was that this is where the Federal Reserve System was conceived, is in that clubhouse. So let's tell that story. It all began in November of 1910 when Senator Nelson Aldrich sent his private railroad car to the New Jersey Railroad Station, where there it was in readiness for the arrival of himself and 6 other men who were instructed to come under conditions of great secrecy. For example, they were told to come one at a time, not to be seen together, not to dine together on the night of their departure. If they had arrived at the same time, they were instructed to pretend as though they didn't even know each other. They were to avoid newspaper reporters, because these were well-known men, and had they been spotted by reporters, which often frequented the railroad station, especially had they been seen together, many questions would have been asked. One of the men carried a shotgun in a big black case, so that if he had been asked where he was going, he was prepared to say that he was going on a duck hunting trip. And the interesting thing about that little piece of the history is that this man, we find out later from his biographer, never fired a gun in his life. He even had to borrow that shotgun in order to participate in this deception. Even after they got on board the railroad car, this pattern continued. They were told to use first names only, not to use last names. Well, the train traveled for 2 nights and a day on a 1,000-mile journey to the south, and when they awoke on the second morning, the car was on the siding, the railroad siding at Brunswick, Georgia. And from there, they took the ferry boat across the inland strait to Jekyll Island and to the clubhouse. And for the next 9 days, these men sat around a table and hammered out all the important details of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System. And incidentally, if you visit that clubhouse today, you can walk down to the end of the one corridor there, and on a door is a brass plaque. And it says, in this room, the Federal Reserve System was created. When they were done, they got back on board the train, back to New York, and disappeared. And for quite a few years after that, these men denied that any such meeting ever took place. It wasn't until after the Federal Reserve was firmly established that only then did they begin to talk openly about it. They wrote books on it. One of them wrote a magazine article, and they gave interviews to newspaper reporters. And so now, many years later, it's possible for us to go to the public record and find in print detailed descriptions of what happened at that meeting. Well, who were these men? The first one I've already mentioned, the one with the railroad car, Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican whip in the Senate. He was also chairman of the National Monetary Commission, which was that special committee of Congress which was created for the purpose of proposing legislation which was to reform banking. That was the idea. Banking needed reform. And the American people were greatly concerned in those days over things that were going on in the banking industry. People were losing their money in the banks because they weren't keeping their promises to hold their deposits in reserve. There were runs on the bank, and the banks couldn't pay the people back. But most of all, they were concerned over the concentration of financial power that was in the hands of a small group of very powerful and large banks in New York on Wall Street. This is what they called the money trust. That was the name, and it was a very popular expression in the newspapers. And quite a few politicians were elected to office on their campaign promise to break the grip of the money trust. President Wilson was one of those politicians, by the way. So, that was the purpose of the National Monetary Commission, which was to propose legislation which eventually became the Federal Reserve Act to break the grip of the money trust over the financial markets of America. Aldrich was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was the father-in-law to John D. Rockefeller, Jr., which means, of course, that eventually he became the grandfather of Nelson Rockefeller, our former vice president. If you remember, his full name was Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, so he derived his middle name from his famous grandfather. The second person at the meeting was Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. He later became a congressman, but he was very prominent in banking circles. Frank Vanderlip was there. He was the president of the National City Bank of New York, which was the largest and the most powerful of all the banks in the country, representing the financial interests of William Rockefeller and the international investment firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Henry Davison was there. He was the senior partner of the J.P. Morgan Company. Charles Norton was present. He was the president of the First National Bank of New York, which was another one of the giants. Also, there was Benjamin Strong, who was the head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And incidentally, 3 years later, when the Federal Reserve System was finally created, he became the first head of the system. And finally, there was Paul Warburg, who was probably the most important of all the men there because of his knowledge of banking as it was practiced in Europe. Paul Warburg was born in Germany. He eventually became a naturalized American citizen. He was a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He was a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France. And through all the years of his banking in America, he remained in very close contact with his brother, Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Paul Warburg was one of the wealthiest men in the world. And those of you who are Little Orphan Annie fans, you'll remember Daddy Warbucks. Well, Paul Warburg was the real Daddy Warbucks, after whom that character was named. And everyone at the time knew it. I have his photograph in the book. If you'd like to compare his picture to the drawing rendition of Daddy Warbucks, you'll see the similarity between Warbucks and Warburg. And also, while we're on the subject of cartoon characters, anyone who's played Monopoly will remember the drawing of the capitalist with the handlebar mustache and the cigar. That's J.P. Morgan. Those are the 7 men who were on Jekyll Island. And as incredible as it may seem, they represented approximately 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And these are the men that sat around a table on Jekyll Island and created the Federal Reserve System. What's going on here? Should arouse our curiosity a little bit. It didn't just happen. What's the big deal here? What's wrong with a group of bankers getting together in private and talking about banking or banking legislation? And the answer to that question is provided by Vanderlip himself in the same article. He said, "If it were to be exposed publicly that our particular group had got together and written a banking bill, that bill would have no chance whatever of passage by Congress. Why not? Because the purpose of the bill was to break the grip of the money trust. And ladies and gentlemen, it was written by the money trust. It's as simple as that. Had that fact been known from the very beginning, the public would never have accepted it as a means of breaking the grip over the money trust. And we would never have had a Federal Reserve System because the scam would have been exposed from the beginning. This was like having the fox build the hen house and install the security system." So there is a primary reason for the secrecy. And it's a fact that most Americans have not even considered, that there might have been some kind of deception, massive deception at the very inception of the Federal Reserve System, and for a very good reason. But there's more to it than that, a lot more than that. Consider the composition of this group and the financial powers they represented. Is there anything strange about that mixture? Here we had the Rockefellers, we had the Morgans, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, all in one room for 9 days plus 2 days on the train, coming to an agreement. What's going on here? Anything strange about that mixture? Well, ladies and gentlemen, these were competitors. These were the giants in the field which prior to this period had been beating their heads against each other for dominance in the marketplace, for dominance in the financial markets of the world, not only New York, but Paris and London, everywhere. Competitors. This is extremely significant because it happened at precisely that point of American history when business was undergoing a major ideological transition. Prior to this period, America had grown and prospered and surpassed all the countries of Europe as an industrial and economic power because it adhered to the principle of free enterprise competition. And it was in this period that a rapid transition was taking place to the concept of monopoly and cartel. Going back, in fact, to the old world concept, which had held Europe back for all these years. Monopolies and cartels were becoming the order of the day in America. It was John D. Rockefeller I who said it. He said, "Competition is a sin." He believed it. All of his biographers quote him on that one, by the way. And he and others of these industrialists of the period were devoting all of their time to the elimination of competition. They did not believe in free enterprise competition at all. They knew that the road to riches and power was through the elimination of their competition. And if they couldn't beat their competition out, then they tried to buy them up. If that didn't work, they joined with them in a shared monopoly, and that is a cartel, a shared monopoly. Perhaps I should define that word in more detail so at least you'll know what I'm talking about when I use the word. A cartel is a group of independently owned businesses which come together for the purpose of reducing or eliminating competition between themselves so that they can enhance their profit margins or secure their position in the marketplace. And they do this by price fixing. We won't compete on price. Or they divide up geographical markets or products and services. For example, if we were forming a cartel here, I might say, well, I get the north and you get the south. We won't compete. Or I might insist that I get to produce the gizmo, but you can produce the widget. And we won't compete. Or we'll share patents and processes. We won't compete. And every time we agree to eliminate one area of competition between ourselves, we move closer and closer together until finally we are as one industry insofar as the marketplace is concerned, even though our component parts are independently owned. And that is a cartel. And so that enhances our profits. We can get more for our products and services than we could in the arena of free enterprise competition. And of course, the other side of that coin is that the public pays more for those products or services than they would otherwise. And that is just as true in a banking cartel as it is in any other kind of cartel. And the amazing fact emerges that when you study this period, that for the 15 years before the meeting on Jekyll Island, these groupings of which we're speaking had come together increasingly in joint ventures. They were learning how to avoid competition between themselves. They knew they couldn't knock each other out. They had tried that. It was too costly. Now it was time to come together. And what happened on Jekyll Island is that they formed a banking cartel, and they called it the Federal Reserve System. An amazing fact that all these years we've had something which most people have thought was a government operation of some kind or another. We were told it was a creation to protect the people, to stabilize the economy, and it's a cartel. And the purpose of a cartel is to enhance the profit structure of the members of the cartel. Period.
So 1910, William Howard Taft was president, and the six gentlemen who were there, Nelson Aldrich, Republican whip in the Senate, Henry Davison, senior partner of J.P. Morgan, A. Piatt Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of National City Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong of J.P. Morgan, and Paul Warburg, partner representing the Rothschilds and Warburgs in Europe. And you say that in here that they represented essentially 1/4 of the entire wealth of the world.
Of the entire world. An incredible statement. That's not my appraisal, but that was the opinion of the journalists at the time who were writing about these people, not in connection with the Federal Reserve, but they were prominent bankers, and they talked about the Jekyll Island Group, for example, and then these bankers in particular, and the investment houses of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and so forth. But they said these men represented directly through the power that they held in their own hands, and indirectly through the money that was concentrated in the investment firms, like the insurance companies and the banking companies. Put it all together, they said it was 1/4 of the wealth of the entire world. And you know, that concentration of wealth has only increased since then.
Well, you asked the question in your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, what is the Federal Reserve, and what is your answer?
Well, what it is, it's a cartel. It's not a government agency. It has the appearance of it being a government agency, and they went to great lengths to give it that facade. It does have the power of government because Congress voted to give the power of enforcement to it. But in its essence, underneath it, it's a cartel. It's nothing different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. They got together They drew up the rules and regulations for their own industry, to self-regulate their own industry is what cartels do. And then they sent it to Congress, and they took off the label at the top that said banking cartel, and they erased that, and they said Federal Reserve Act. Congress passed it into law, and that's why we think it's a government agency, is because if you don't obey the rules that they set down for their own industry, you go to prison. And so it looks like a government agency. But basically the answer to your question is it's a banking cartel.
While there's been some movements to combat this globalist totalitarian network, which has not only financed communist revolutions around the world, such as in Russia, China, and more recently in South Africa, which were all triggered by engineered social uprisings aimed to remove existing power structures using class warfare and amplifying socioeconomic and racial tensions enforced by a banker-controlled media. We can see the same pattern played out in America today, where manufactured civil unrest is used to erase history and promote cultural Marxism, in a nation which already promotes falsehoods in schools, starting from its name, which was not really based on the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose authentic name was actually Alberigo Vespucci, who only changed his name to Amerigo after his voyages to the Americas. In other words, Amerigo came from America and not the other way around. Not only was there an existing tribe in Nicaragua called Americ, whose root word was the ancient name for the land used by the natives of Peru, also known to the Maya civilization and attributed to the great feathered serpent creator deity which they called Kukulkan, a deity which also had an equivalent by the Aztec civilization. According to Manly P. Hall, in his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, quote, "These children of the sun adored the plumed serpent, who was the messenger of the sun. He was the god Quetzalcoatl in Mexico, Gucamat in Quiche, and in Peru he was called Amaru. From the latter name comes our word America. Amaruca is, literally translated, land of the plumed serpent. The priests of this flying dragon, from their chief center, they once ruled both Americas. One of their strong centers was Guatemala, and of their order was the author of the book called Popol Vuh. Many Mesoamerican and Native Indian tribes also record in their oral traditions encounters and conflicts with giants, or at least very tall people in the past. I also covered this topic in several videos, showing documentation regarding many discoveries of giant skeletons, which have been published in newspapers, and then seemingly forgotten to history, except for mythology, or mentions of giants in the Bible. In many biblical interpretations, the serpent is synonymous with Lucifer, the fallen angel thrown down by God, which literally translates to light bearer, a symbol which can be found in many parts of the ancient pre-Christian world. In his book, The Occult Connection to the Hidden Race, author Ken Hoodall proposes that, quote, "Then perhaps the land of the plumed serpent may also be known as the land of Lucifer," concluding that America means the land of Lucifer. While this interpretation may sound like a real stretch for many, it's an interesting concept when considered from the perspective of an interview that I recently stumbled upon, suggested to me by one of my subscribers, which uncovered some interesting details regarding the secretive meeting on Jekyll Island and events that led up to the creation of the Federal Reserve. The gentleman being interviewed is Tim Bentz, and the host of the show is Rob Sepehr from a broadcast on Blog Talk Radio titled Canaanite Altars and the Federal Reserve. I'll leave a link to the full interview in the description, but now let's listen to a brief excerpt, and I'll leave it to the listener to draw their own conclusions.
I knew something about Jekyll Island. I had looked at some of the financial issues in the 80s and 90s. I was looking at some of the spiritual applications to financial things, but I really was not up to speed on the history of Jekyll Island. I had just heard it from something. I'd not even read the book that's called The Creature of Jekyll Island. I've not even read that book, but I was aware of something about Jekyll Island and financial stuff. So I went in my brother's house, got my computer out, and I just, got on the internet and typed in Jekyll Island, and it's like, what's going on with Jekyll Island? And so I discovered when I got online that the Jekyll Island Club, which was this historical, multi-millionaires country club that had been built in the turn of the century, it had just been remodeled and reopened. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. When I got to the hotel, it was about 9 o'clock at night. And so I went in the restaurant and had a good meal and went to my room and got some rest. And the next morning I went down for breakfast, and a different lady was at the desk, but she had a note for me. It said that I had an appointment arranged with the museum director, and that he was blocking out most of the day to spend with me. So I had my breakfast, and then when I went over to meet with him. So I go meet with the museum gentleman. His name is John, and when I go meet with him, I just introduced myself. I told him a little bit about who I was and what I do. We started talking. He was, of course, started out talking about the financial stuff, because this Jekyll Island is where the Federal Reserve banking system was birthed and conceived. And at one time, when it was functioning in the 1900s up to the 20s and 30s, some say 1/3, some say 2/3 of the world's wealth would vacation on that island. Mm-hmm. It was the highest conglomeration of wealth in a single place very often anywhere in the world back in the turn of the century. So it just seems like a little island that's not anything significant at all now, but it's amazing to see the financial side of the history of that spot. And so I'm sitting there looking at some of the things that he's telling, and just thinking about some of the things he's telling me. We went out and walked around, and he showed me some of the cottages that had been restored, and the club itself, and the tennis courts, and they had a pier where the boats would come up, and he's just kind of showing me the grounds, and then we go to the museum and talking a lot about the financial stuff and the guys that built it. And each cottage was, marked and named. Some of them had been restored, some of them didn't exist anymore, but they had like a sign that this is where this one was, and that one was built by J.P. Morgan, that one was Rockefeller's, and that one was they had each one of them named. Well, they're all kind of native names, and then they're all got some kind of a plaque on who the financial mogul was that had built them. And they're not really elaborate, luxurious mansions. They're just simple cottages for the most part, which was kind of interesting to know that the richest people in the world built them, and they were very low-key and almost like a cabin in the woods instead of a luxurious house like you'd expect. And they all had Indian names. So I started asking him about the Indian history of the island, and he lit up. He just was like, that's what he really wanted to talk about, because he loved the Indian history. And so he takes me back to the museum, and he said, we got a lot of stuff on the Indians. He said this was actually like the government main community for a tribe of Indians that don't exist anymore. And that tribe was called the Timucas. And I said, well, that's interesting. My name's Tim. And anyway, I didn't know anything about the Timucas. I'm from Oklahoma. I've learned a lot of Native history, and I have some Native bloodline, but I did not know anything about the Timucas. So I just asked him, please tell me everything that you can tell me about them. There's something about the natives that I feel like I need to know. So he said, well, the Jekyll Island Club was actually built on top of everything that the Indians had. So they just kind of wiped the village out and built a club on top of it. So wherever the chief's house was, there was a cottage now. Wherever the council house was, there was now the Jekyll Island Hotel. And he said everything that's built and visible today is actually sitting right on top of something that was significant in the Indian village when it existed. So he said the fact that this whole place had to go into ruins and then be rebuilt and become an archaeological state park, he said it actually helped us identify the native history because the club itself had almost erased that. And so I said, well, let's look at the museum. I want to see some of the Indian stuff. So we're looking at arrowheads and spear tips and, just artifacts that they had found and pottery shards and things and seashells that they had had. And he's showing me all their stuff in the museum. He shows me some fragments of a weapon that was like an unusual bow. And when I say unusual, I mean that it was like a double curved bow. And that was a very unusual shape of the bow for a native tribe. I had never seen that shape before with an American Indian tribe. And I've seen a lot of bows and arrows. So I asked him, I said, this seems unusual. I've not seen this before. In Oklahoma, every native tribe, the bows would look like a single bow or just a single curve. I said, this is quite extraordinary, especially as far back as this tribe was. So he said, yeah, we found a lot of weapon-type artifacts that we've not seen with other tribes. And I said, well, how do you know these were Native Americans? Maybe they were from somewhere else. He said,
Two great mysteries dominate our lives, love and money. What is love is a question that has been endlessly explored in stories, songs, books, movies, and television. But the same cannot be said about the question, what is money? It's not surprising that monetary theory hasn't inspired any blockbuster movies, but it was not even mentioned at the schools most of us attended. For most of us, the question, where does money come from, brings to mind a picture of the mint, printing bills and stamping coins. Money, most of us believe, is created by the government. It's true, but only to a point. Those metal and paper symbols of value we usually think of as money are indeed produced by an agency of the federal government called the Mint. But the vast majority of money is not created by the Mint. It is created in huge amounts every day by private corporations known as banks. Most of us believe that banks lend out money that has been entrusted to them by depositors. Easy to picture, but not the truth. In fact, banks create the money they loan, not from the bank's own earnings, not from the money deposited, but directly from the borrower's promise to repay. The borrower's signature on the loan papers is an obligation to pay the bank the amount of the loan plus interest, or lose the house, the car, whatever asset was pledged as collateral. That's a big commitment from the borrower. What does the same signature require of the bank? The bank gets to conjure into existence the amount of the loan and just write it into the borrower's account. Sound far-fetched? Surely that can't be true. But it is. To demonstrate how this miracle of modern banking came about, consider this simple story, the goldsmith's tale. Once upon various times, pretty much anything was used as money. It just had to be portable, and enough people had to have faith that it could later be exchanged for things of real value, like food, clothing, and shelter. Shells, cocoa beans, pretty stones, even feathers have been used as money. Gold and silver were attractive, soft, and easy to work with, so some cultures became expert with these metals. Goldsmiths made trade much easier by casting coins, standardized units of these metals whose weight and purity was certified. Well, to protect his gold, the goldsmith needed a vault, and soon his fellow townsmen were knocking on his door, wanting to rent space to safeguard their own coins and valuables. Before long, the goldsmith was renting every shelf in the vault and earning a small income from his vault rental business. Years went by, and the goldsmith made an astute observation. Depositors rarely came in to remove their actual physical gold, and they never all came in at once. That was because the claim checks the goldsmith had written as receipts for the gold were being traded in the marketplace as if they were the gold itself. This paper money was far more convenient than heavy coins, and amounts could simply be written instead of laboriously counted one by one for each transaction. Meanwhile, the goldsmith had another business. He lent out his gold, charging interest. Well, as convenient claim check money came into acceptance, borrowers began asking for their loans in the form of these claim checks instead of the actual metal. As industry expanded, more and more people asked the goldsmith for loans. This gave the goldsmith an even better idea. He knew that very few of his depositors ever removed their actual gold, so the goldsmith figured he could easily get away with lending out claim checks against his depositors' gold, in addition to his own. As long as the loans were repaid, his depositors would be none the wiser and no worse off, and the goldsmith, now more banker than artisan, would make a far greater profit than he could by lending only his own gold. For years, the goldsmith secretly enjoyed a good income from the interest earned on everybody else's deposits. Now a prominent lender, he grew steadily richer than his fellow townsmen, and he flaunted it. Suspicions grew that he was spending his depositors' money. His depositors got together and threatened withdrawal of their gold if the goldsmith didn't come clean about his newfound wealth. Contrary to what one might expect, this did not turn out to be a disaster for the goldsmith. Despite the duplicity inherent in his scheme, his idea did work. The depositors had not lost anything. Their gold was all safe in the goldsmith's vault. Well, rather than taking back their gold, the depositors demanded that the goldsmith, now their banker, cut them in by paying them a share of the interest. And that was the beginning of banking. The banker paid a low interest rate on deposits of other people's money that he then loaned out at a higher interest. The difference covered the bank's cost of operation and its profit. The logic of this system was simple, and it seemed like a reasonable way to satisfy the demand for credit. However, this is not the way banking works today. Our goldsmith banker was not content with the income remaining after sharing the interest earnings with his depositors, and the demand for credit was growing fast as Europeans spread out across the world. But his loans were limited by the amount of gold his depositors had in his vault. That's when he got an even bolder idea. Since no one but himself knew what was actually in his vaults, he could lend out claim checks on gold that wasn't even there. As long as all the claim check holders didn't come to the vault at the same time and demand real gold, how would anyone find out? This new scheme worked very well, and the banker became enormously wealthy on the interest paid on gold that did not exist. The idea that the banker would just create money out of nothing was too outrageous to believe, so for a long time the thought did not occur to people. But the power to just invent money went to the banker's head, as you can well imagine. In time, the magnitude of the banker's loans and his ostentatious wealth did trigger suspicions once again. Some borrowers started to demand real gold instead of paper representations. Rumors spread. Suddenly, several wealthy depositors showed up to remove their gold. The game was up. A sea of claim check holders flooded the street outside the closed doors of the bank. Alas, the banker did not have enough gold and silver to redeem all the paper he had put into their hands. This is called a run on the bank, and it is what every banker dreads. This phenomenon of a run on the bank ruined individual banks and, not surprisingly, damaged public confidence in all bankers. It would have been straightforward to outlaw the practice of creating money from nothing. But the large volumes of credit the bankers were offering had become essential to the success of European commercial expansion. So instead, the practice was legalized and regulated. Bankers agreed to abide by limits on the amount of fictional loan money that could be lent out. The limit would still be a number much larger than the actual value of gold and silver in the vault. Quite often the ratio was 9 fictional dollars to 1 actual dollar in gold. These regulations were enforced by surprise inspections. It was also arranged that in the event of a run, central banks would support local banks with emergency infusions of gold. Only if there were runs on a lot of banks simultaneously would the banker's credit bubble burst and the system come crashing down. Over the years, the fractional reserve system and its integrated network of banks backed by a central bank has become the dominant money system of the world. At the same time, the fraction of gold backing the debt money has steadily shrunk to nothing. The basic nature of money has changed. In the past, a paper dollar was actually a receipt that could be redeemed for a fixed weight of gold or silver. In the present, a paper or digital dollar can only be redeemed for another paper or digital dollar. In the past, privately created bank credit existed only in the form of private banknotes, which people had the choice to refuse, just as we have the choice to refuse someone's private check today. In the present, privately created bank credit is legally convertible to government-issued fiat currency, the dollars, loonies, and pounds we habitually think of as money. Fiat currency is money created by government fiat or decree, and legal tender laws declare that citizens must accept this fiat money as payment for debt, or else the courts will not enforce the obligation. So now the question is, if governments and banks can both just create money, then how much money exists? In the past, the total amount of money in existence was limited to the actual physical quantities of whatever commodity was in use as money. For example, in order for new gold or silver money to be created, more gold or silver had to be found and dug out of the ground. In the present, money is literally created as debt. New money is created whenever anyone takes a loan from the bank. As a result, the total amount of money that can be created has only one real limit: the total level of debt. Governments place an additional statutory limit on the creation of new money by enforcing rules known as fractional reserve requirements. Essentially arbitrary, fractional reserve requirements vary from country to country and from time to time. In the past, it was common to require banks to have at least $1 worth of real gold in the vault to back $10 worth of debt money created. Today, reserve requirement ratios no longer apply to the ratio of new money to gold on deposit, but merely to the ratio of new debt money to existing debt money on deposit in the bank. Today, a bank's reserves consists of three things: the amount of government-issued cash that the bank has in its vault, the amount of credit it has with the central bank, and the amount of already existing debt money the bank has on deposit. To illustrate this in a simple way, let's imagine that a new bank has just started up and has no depositors yet. Investors have paid for the bank's infrastructure and have supplied it with sufficient cash to meet the demand for cash withdrawals. Typically, cash in the vault will amount to no more than $1 for every $20 or $30 that could be demanded from the bank. The bank has joined the central bank system, which permits the new bank to borrow cash from the central bank if it's needed. The doors open and the new bank welcomes its first loan customer. The customer needs $10,000 to buy a car. On approval, the bank creates an account for the borrower and types in that the bank owes the borrower $10,000. This $10,000 is not taken from anywhere. It's created on the spot. The borrower does not take this money out in cash. Instead, he writes a check on his account to buy the car. The seller then deposits this newly created $10,000 check at her bank. At a ratio of 9 to 1, this new $10,000 deposit allows the seller's bank to create a new loan of $9,000. And if that $9,000 is then deposited by a third party, it becomes the legal basis for a third issue of bank credit, this time for the amount of $8,100. Like one of those Russian dolls, each layer of which contains a smaller doll inside, each new deposit contains the potential for a slightly smaller loan in a decreasing series. Now, at any stage, if the money created is taken out in cash and not deposited at a bank, the process stops. That's the unpredictable part of the money creation mechanism. But more likely, at every step, the new bank credit money will be deposited at a bank, and the reserve ratio process can repeat itself over and over until almost $100,000 of brand new bank credit money has been created within the banking system. All of this new money has been created entirely from debt, and all transactions have been carried out with bank credit. None of the banks involved have needed to use any of the cash in their vaults. What's more, under this ingenious system, the books of each bank in the chain must show that the bank has 10% more on deposit than it has out on loan. This gives banks a very real incentive to seek deposits in order to be able to make loans, supporting the general but misleading impression that loans come out of deposits. Now, it can't be said that any one bank got to multiply the initial $10,000 of bank credit into $100,000 of bank credit. However, the banking system is a closed loop. Bank credit created at one bank becomes a deposit in another, and so on and so on. In a theoretical world of perfectly equal exchanges, the banks would owe each other nothing at the end of the day, and the $10,000 created out of thin air as a loan by the first bank could indeed become almost $100,000 of new loan money in the banking system. If that sounds ridiculous, try this. Actual reserve ratios can be much higher than 9 to 1. For some types of accounts, 20 to 1 and 33 to 1 ratios are common. There are also many exceptions where no reserve requirements apply at all. So, while the rules are complex, the common sense reality is actually quite simple. Banks can create as much money as we can borrow. Despite the endlessly presented mint footage, government-created money typically accounts for less than 5% of the money in circulation. More than 95% of all money in existence today was created by someone signing a pledge of indebtedness to a bank. What's more, this bank credit money is being created and destroyed in huge amounts every day as new loans are made and old ones repaid. Banks can only practice this money system with the active cooperation of government. First, governments pass legal tender laws to make us use the national fiat currency. Secondly, governments allow private bank credit to be paid out in this government currency. Thirdly, government courts enforce debts. And lastly, governments pass regulations to protect the money system's functionality and credibility with the public, while doing nothing to inform the public about where money really comes from. The simple truth is that when we sign on the dotted line for a so-called loan or mortgage, our signed pledge of payment, backed by the assets we pledge to forfeit should we fail to pay, is the only thing of real value involved in the transaction. To anyone who believes we will honor our pledge, that loan agreement or mortgage is now a portable, exchangeable, and saleable piece of paper. It's an IOU. It represents value and is therefore a form of money. This money the borrower exchanges for the bank's so-called loan. Now, a loan in the real world means that the lender must have something to lend. If you need a hammer, my loaning you a promise to provide a hammer I don't have won't be of much help. But in the artificial world of money, a bank's promise to pay money it doesn't have is allowed to be passed off as money, and we accept it as such. Once the borrower signs the pledge of debt, the bank then balances the transaction by creating, with a few keystrokes on a computer, a matching debt of the bank to the borrower. From the borrower's point of view, this becomes loan money in his or her account, and because the government allows this debt of the bank to the borrower to be converted to government fiat currency, everyone has to accept it as money. Again, the basic truth is very simple. Without the document the borrower signed, the banker would have nothing to lend. Have you ever wondered how everyone, governments, corporations, small businesses, families, can all be in debt at the same time and for such astronomical amounts? Have you ever questioned how there can be that much money out there to lend? Now you know, there isn't. Banks do not lend money. They simply create it from debt. And as debt is potentially unlimited, so is the supply of money. And as it turns out, the opposite situation is also true. Isn't it astounding that despite the incredible wealth of resources, innovation, and productivity that surrounds us, almost all of us, from governments to companies to individuals, are heavily in debt to bankers? If only people would stop and think, how can that be? How can it be that the people who actually produce all the real wealth in the world are in debt to those who merely lend out the money that represents the wealth? Even more amazing is that once we realize that money really is debt, we realize that if there was no debt, there'd be no money. this is news to you, you are not alone. Most people imagine that if all debts were paid off, the state of the economy would improve. It's certainly true on an individual level. Just as we have more money to spend when our loan payments are finished, we think that if everyone were out of debt, there would be more money to spend in general. But the truth is the exact opposite. There would be no money at all. There it is. We are totally dependent on continually renewed bank credit for there to be any money in existence. No loans, no money, which is what happened during the Great Depression. The money supply shrank drastically as the supply of loans dried up. And that's not all. Banks create only the amount of the principal. They don't create the money to pay the interest. Where is that supposed to come from? The only place borrowers can go to obtain the money to pay interest is the general economy's overall money supply. But almost all that overall money supply has been created exactly the same way, as bank credit that has to be paid back with more than was created. So everywhere there are other borrowers in the same situation, frantically trying to obtain the money they need to pay back both principal and interest from a total money pool which contains only principal. Big problem here is that for long-term loans, such as mortgages and government debt, the total interest far exceeds the principal. So unless a lot of extra money is created to pay the interest, it means a very high proportion of foreclosures and a non-functioning economy. To maintain a functional society, the rate of foreclosure needs to be low. And so, to accomplish this, more and more new debt money has to be created to satisfy today's demands for money to service the previous debt. But of course, this just makes the total debt bigger, and that means more interest must ultimately be paid, resulting in an ever-escalating and inescapable spiral of mounting indebtedness. It is only the time lag between money's creation as new loans and its repayment that keeps the overall shortage of money from catching up and bankrupting the entire system. However, as the bank's insatiable credit monster gets bigger and bigger, the need to create more and more debt money to feed it becomes increasingly urgent. Why are interest rates so low? Why do we get unsolicited credit cards in the mail? Why is the U.S. government spending faster than ever? Could it be to stave off collapse of the entire monetary system? A rational person has to ask, can this really go on forever? Isn't a collapse inevitable? Money facilitates production and trade. As the money supply increases, money just becomes increasingly worthless unless the volume of production and trade in the real world grows by the same amount. Add to this the realization that when we hear that the economy is growing at 3% per year, it sounds like a constant rate, but it's not. This year's 3% represents more real goods and services than last year's 3% because it's 3% of the new total. Instead of a straight line, as is naturally visualized from the words, it is really an exponential curve getting steeper and steeper. The problem, of course, is that perpetual growth of the real economy requires perpetually escalating use of real-world resources and energy. More and more stuff has to go from natural resource to garbage every year forever, just to keep this system from collapsing. What can we do about this downright scary situation? For one thing, we need a very different concept of money. It's time more people ask themselves and their governments 4 simple questions. Around the world, governments borrow money at interest from private banks. Government debt is a major component of total debt, and servicing that debt takes a big chunk of our taxes. Now we know that banks simply create the money they lend, and that governments have given them permission to do this. So the first question is, why do governments choose to borrow money from private banks at interest when government could create all the interest-free money it needs itself? And the second big question is, why create money as debt at all? Why not create money that circulates permanently and doesn't have to be perpetually reborrowed at interest in order to exist? The third question, how can a money system that can only function with perpetually accelerating growth be used to build a sustainable economy? Isn't it logical that perpetually accelerating growth and sustainability are incompatible? And finally, what is it about our current system that makes it totally dependent on perpetual growth? What needs to be changed to allow the creation of a sustainable economy? At one time, charging any interest on a loan was called usury and was subject to severe penalties, including death. Every major religion forbade usury. Most of the arguments made against the practice were moral. It was held that money's only legitimate purpose was to facilitate the exchange of real goods and services. Any form of making money from simply having money was regarded as the act of a parasite or of a thief. However, as the credit needs of commerce increased, the moral arguments eventually gave way to the argument that lending involves risk and loss of opportunity to the lender, and therefore attempting to make a profit from lending is justified. Today, these notions seem quaint. Today, the idea of making money from money is held as an ideal to strive for. Why work when you can get your money to work for you? However, in trying to envision a sustainable future, it's very clear that the charging of interest is both a moral and a practical problem. Imagine a society and economy that can endure for centuries because, instead of plundering its capital stores of energy, it restricts itself to present-day income. No more wood is harvested than grows in the same period. All energy is renewable: solar, gravitational, geothermal, magnetic, and whatever else we discover. This society lives within the limits of its non-renewable resources by reusing and recycling everything, and the population just replaces itself. Such a society could never function using a money system utterly dependent on perpetually accelerating growth. A stable economy would need a money supply at least capable of remaining stable without collapsing. Let's say the total volume of this stable money supply is represented by this big circle. Let's also imagine that moneylenders must actually have existing money to lend. If some people within this money supply begin systematically lending money at interest, their share of the money supply will grow. If they continually reloan at interest all the money that gets paid back, what's the inevitable result? Whether it's gold, fiat, or debt money doesn't matter. The money lenders will end up with all the money. And after the foreclosures and bankruptcies are all filed, they'll get all the real property too. Only if the proceeds of lending at interest were evenly distributed among the population would this central problem be solved. Heavy taxation of bank profits might accomplish this goal, but then why would banks want to be in business? If we were ever able to free ourselves of the current situation, we could imagine banking run as a non-profit service to society, dispersing its interest earnings as a universal citizen dividend, or lending without charging interest at all. If it is the fundamental nature of the system that causes the problems, tinkering with the system cannot ever solve those problems. The system itself must be replaced. Many monetary critics call for a return to gold-based money, claiming that gold has a long history of reliability. They ignore the many scams that can be played with gold, shaving coins, debasing the metal, cornering the market, all of which were abundantly practiced in ancient Rome and contributed to its fall. Some advocate silver as being more abundant than gold and therefore more difficult to corner. Many question the need to bring back precious metals at all. No one wants to go back to carrying heavy sacks of coins to go shopping. It's a certainty that paper, digital, plastic, or more likely biometric ID money would be the real medium of trade with the same potential for creating unlimited debt money we have now. Beyond that, if gold again became the sole legal basis of money, those who have no gold would suddenly have no money. Other monetary reform advocates have concluded that greed and dishonesty are the main problems, and that there may be better ways to create an honest and equitable money system than returning to silver or gold. Inventive minds have proposed a variety of alternate ways to create money. Many private barter systems create money as debt, much as banks do, but it is done openly and without charging interest. An example is a barter system in which debt is expressed as pledges of hours of work, all work being valued equally at a dollar figure that then allows hours to be equated with a dollar price of goods. This kind of money system can be set up by anyone who can devise a way to do the accounting and find willing and trustworthy participants. Setting up a local barter money system, even if it were little used now, would be prudent emergency planning for any community. Monetary reform, like electoral reform, is a big topic, and one that requires a willingness to change and to think outside the box. Monetary reform, again, like electoral reform, will not come easily, because the enormously powerful interests that benefit from the existing system will do their utmost to maintain their advantage. Now that we've seen that money is just an idea, and that in reality money can be whatever we make it, here's one very simple alternative monetary concept to consider. This model is based on systems that have worked in the past, in England and America, systems that were undermined and destroyed by the goldsmith bankers and their fractional reserve system. To create an economy based on permanent interest-free money, money could simply be created and spent into the economy by the government, preferably on long-lasting infrastructure that facilitates the economy, such as roads, railroads, bridges, harbors, and public markets. This money would not be created as debt. It would be created as value, that value being in the form of whatever it was spent on. If this new money facilitated a proportional increase in trade requiring its use, it would cause no inflation whatsoever. If government spending did cause inflation, there would be two courses of action available. Inflation is equivalent in effect to a flat tax on money. Whether the money goes down in value 20% or the government takes 20% of our money away from us, the effect on our buying power is the same. Viewed this way, inflation in place of taxation might be politically acceptable if well spent and kept within limits. Or government could choose to counter inflation by collecting tax monies that it then takes out of use, thus reducing the money supply and restoring its value. To control deflation, which is the phenomenon of falling wages and prices, the government would simply spend more money into existence. With no competing private debt money creation, governments would have more effective control of their nation's money supply. The public would know whom to blame if things went wrong. Governments would rise and fall on their ability to preserve the value of money. Government would operate primarily on taxes, as it does now, but tax money would go much, much further, as none of it would be required to pay interest to private bankers. There could be no national debt if the federal government simply created the money it needed. Our perpetual collective servitude to the banks through interest payments on government debt would be impossible. What we have been taught to believe as democracy and freedom has become in reality an ingenious and invisible form of economic dictatorship. As long as our entire society remains utterly dependent on bank credit for its supply of money, bankers will be in the position to make the decisions on who gets the money they need and who doesn't. Few people are aware today that the history of the United States since the Revolution in 1776 has been, in large part, the story of an epic struggle to get free and stay free of control by the European international banks. This struggle was finally lost in 1913 when President Woodrow Wilson signed into effect the Federal Reserve Act, putting the international banking cartel in charge of creating America's money. power of this system is deeply ingrained. So is the educational and media silence on the subject. Years ago, a Canadian Deputy Prime Minister surveyed scores of non-economists, both highly educated professionals and common-sense people on the street, and found that not one of them had an accurate understanding of how money is created. In fact, it's probably safe to say that most people, including the frontline employees of banks, have never given the matter a moment's thought. Have you? The modern money as debt system was born a little over 300 years ago, when the first Bank of England was set up with a royal charter for fractional lending of gold receipts at a modest ratio of 2 to 1. That modest ratio was just the proverbial foot in the door. The system is now worldwide, creates virtually unlimited amounts of money out of thin air, and has almost everyone on the planet chained to a perpetually growing debt that can never be paid off. Could it have all happened by accident? Or is it a conspiracy? Obviously, something very big is at stake here.
And I wrote a poem about it. I wrote the piece of music back in 1968. And I wrote a poem about it I was trying to write words about it actually for a long time. And I finally gave up because I couldn't get the words to fit the melody. Because every time I thought about the melody, I thought about it different. So what I did, I wrote this poem, and I called this poem Silent Annie. This was my sort of imagination of who the Lonesome Boatman was. So I'll do it for you. Right? Oui. I saw which nearly broke my heart. A tramp lay dying in a park. I knelt beside him to hear him speak. The words he spoke, they were oh so weak. He told me a story of long since past, of his sailing ship with his long grey mast, of his captain's cap with its shining braid, and the wonderful voyages that he made. Silent Annie was his great ship's name. Like a token of love, he spoke her name. She sailed round the Horn, aye more than once. She could cut through the waves like a sharpened lance. Believe me, he said, his eyes filled with tears, like a drunk on a corner trying to remember his years. He reached out his hand, and I took it in mine. I believe you, I said, and he gave a sad smile. I remember the day when they towed her away. Her sides to her sore from the sea's angered spray. They said she's unfit for the sail out once more, and they towed her more inward from her own sandy shore. And as they broke my silent Annie, I watched with a sigh. I remembered her beauty when I was a boy. She was my one love, my life's only dream, when we sailed out together as captain and queen. It started to drizzle and I felt my hand tight. And he squeezed even harder as he ended the fight. And the crowd, they had gathered and they watched with dismay as the marvelous men came and they took him away. So I got to my feet and I walked through that park. The sun, it was gone, but it was not yet dark. My body was wet, my clothes were not many, but my mind was aroused by his ship, Silent Annie. Lost a Boatman. Thank you.